Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm really thrilled that Randy and the AFT are taking a leadership role on this issue and putting it on the agenda. My comments are in the frame of sort of this broad conversation that we intended to have, and are not specifically tailored to today's announcement by the Department of Education and the Department of Justice, although I welcome it, and we'll have some comments about that. But so I come to this conversation with kind of a variety of backgrounds. I started at, as Bernie said, I was a public defender, and I started out in juvenile court. And one of my very first cases as a juvenile defender right here in D.C. Was the charge. My client was 14 years old, and this charge was ADW, assault with a dangerous weapon. Now, in D.C., when you get a charging document, it says ADW, and then parentheses will have the weapon. So typically, you know, the standard is ADW knife, or ADW gun, or, you know, some sort of club. So this said ADW, and then in parentheses it said chocolate milk. Now, I had just started. I had just started. It was only my second or third case. And there's a little tradition at PDS of sometimes the more senior lawyers will like pull a little prank on the new lawyer and see how you react. So I thought, well, maybe this is some kind of joke, you know, ADW chocolate milk. But no, it was real. And I went into the cell block, and I met my client. And I went and talked to the prosecuting attorney, and I said, you know, this is crazy, like ADW chocolate milk. Let's just get rid of this case and dismiss it and move on. And it's really unfortunate that, you know, he's been locked up for 8 hours already on this, in handcuffs, in a cell. I mean, the same cell that you'd be in if you were there on a murder charge. There's only one cell. He was there for ADW chocolate milk. And the prosecutor looked at me and said, explained that it was two kids that that my client allegedly had thrown a carton of milk. And she said, now you might think it was just like loose milk, but it was actually one of those little milk cartons. And I said, you know, like a half-pint milk carton, like the kind you get at lunch? And she said, yeah. And she was totally adamant that this was not a mistake. This was an appropriate charge. Now, I was practicing now in the beginning of the zero-tolerance era. This was the mid-1990s when really this had begun to kick off. And the federal government had played a role at that point, and it wasn't a positive role. The federal government had helped to create this with the initial laws that required districts to expel kids for certain offenses, not for ADW milk, I should say. So eventually, you know, this case worked itself out and the kid got probation. But again, he's now on probation in juvenile court for something that, I mean, I went to school. I remember fights in the cafeteria, and it's not a good thing. And schools and cafeterias should not be disorderly, and and that needs to be dealt with, but not in this way, was the conclusion that I drew. I also had other experiences as a public defender where I really saw how this plays out in the lives of kids. And a lot of it is not captured by law, not captured by regulation. It's under the radar discretion that school administrators have, which they can use for good or for ill, just as this prosecutor could have used her discretion in that instance for good or for ill. One of the common ones is kids get into the juvenile court system. They spend 3 months or 6 months locked up on some offense. Now they're released. They come back. They want to go back to school. What happens to them? I had many instances where I would go to the principal's office of the neighborhood school, and the school administrators there would basically give us a variety of, well, he's been out of school, he's missed half a year, there's this other program that will be better for him. Well, again, in the abstract, an alternative program, I'm all for it. if it's a program that has excellent teaching, that has a rigorous curriculum that's tied to some sort of real educational goals for students. But of course, the alternative schools in general, not 100%, but in general that we have, are not that way. They are too often dumping grounds. And kids that go into the juvenile system, when they come out, they are pushed into those sorts of programs. And it's very, very hard for parents. I mean, I was a lawyer with all the resources, the ability to not even take time off work. This was my job. I could go down and sit in the central office and argue with the person and say, no, this kid is on grade level or only a year behind. He needs to go back to his neighborhood school. He wants to go back to his neighborhood school. He's entitled to go back to his neighborhood school. But those are hard fights to win as a lawyer. Now imagine you're a parent. You have a job. You might have 2 jobs. You've got to take time off work. You get run from office to office to office. These are the way, and eventually you give up. You're demoralized, you're dispirited, you give up, and you accept the substandard alternative placement. These are some of the subtle, hard to see in even some of the numbers, ways in which kids that don't have a lot of resources get pushed into, out of school, into the juvenile justice system, and then are not able to reconnect back to school when they return from the juvenile justice system. So that's what really brought me to this issue as a lawyer. Then, as Bernie mentioned, I started a school, and we were determined, and it was based on these experiences. I wanted to try to set up a school that works specifically with these kids that I felt, and lots of people in the system said to me straight up, yes, we know we don't do right by the kids that you're representing in juvenile court. And I also saw this issue then from the standpoint of what it takes to run a school and how hard it is. And this is, again, so when I talk to educators, I will express my frustrations with them sometimes around things like I just described, this use of discretion to keep a kid out of the regular school, push him into an alternative school. But when I talk to lawyers and to activists and other, I also talk to them about, have you actually tried to do this? Do you actually know what it means on a daily basis to teach a group of students who may be 1 or 2 or 3 years behind grade level to begin with, and now you've got 1 or 2 or 3 people that is making it harder for the classroom to operate, and you're now faced with this challenge of you want to teach everybody, a couple of people are making it harder, what do you do? And that's hard. It is really hard to do well. And what we've done now as a matter of federal policy and state policy and district policy is we've basically given teachers and administrators who are faced with this really hard task one set of options. We've given them and we've pushed as a nation. And we are, to some extent, almost everybody is complicit in this. There's not a lot, if you go back and look at the history from the 1990s and how this came into being, there are not a lot of people with clean hands on this. The federal government doesn't have clean hands. The state government doesn't have clean hands. The teachers' unions do not have clean hands. There are very few people that can stand up and say, we didn't contribute in some way to the system that we have now created. But, so there it is. The system is one that pushes zero tolerance. It under-invests in these kinds of alternatives that Randy was talking about. I mean, there are some lines in this new, in this report that the government has put out, things like, in terms of what would work, they say things like, school-based mental health professionals are central to implementing tiered supports because they help to identify students' needs and provide mental health supports based on those needs. Yeah, that's true. That is absolutely true. And school-based mental health professionals are sorely lacking. We have not, as a matter of national policy, state policy, or district policy, decided to invest in putting those sorts of individuals in our schools, let alone training them with how they should perform. So this is sort of where we are at. This issue has a clear racial component. All of the numbers that you've heard today have support that. Basically, every study that anybody has done on this issue has found racial disparities at some level. The amount is different district by district, state by state. Sometimes it's, blacks and Latino students 2 times is likely to be suspended. In some states it's 3 times, in some states it's 4 times, but it's across the board. And whenever it's hard to control for other factors, but when people have attempted to control for other demographic factors, they nonetheless find that there's still a disparity along the basis of race. However, we should also be clear that it is beyond a racial issue as well. There are plenty of communities where the kids are almost all white that have a problem with zero tolerance, that have a problem with excessive use of suspensions and expulsions. So the numbers for black students and Latino students are especially and egregiously bad, but this is a national problem that affects every community. We are in terms of over-relying on these punitive measures. And I wouldn't want us to lose sight of that, even as we also very much keep appropriately our eye on the racial disparity question. I do think this panel, today's announcement, the number of people who are in the room are all bits of evidence to suggest that we are at something of a turning point on this issue. There is now, at least in terms of attention, now whether that will translate into policy changes remains to be seen, but there is attention that's being paid to this issue in a way that is not true. Back when I was first trying to raise these questions in the mid-90s about the craziness of the ADW chocolate milk and such, it was much harder to get people to pay attention than it is today. And today's announcement from the federal government, I think, is a step in the right direction. But I do want to, talk about some things that I think we need to do and to keep an eye on to make sure that this translates into real change going forward. So first of all is something I alluded to when I talked about my experience running a school that has struggled with some of these very same issues. And one is the recognition that these are not, this will not be easy to solve. There are some low-hanging fruit, let me be clear. There are some examples, whether it's kids getting suspended and expelled for discipline infractions like having a cell phone that they're not supposed to have, or some of these some of these codes of conduct that allow for suspension and expulsion for these very broad categories like willful defiance of instruction, and that there are some really clear examples, and the Department of Education, OCR, has highlighted some of these that could be changed quickly, and it would make a real difference. Once we move beyond that, though, we do get to some harder challenges, and those are some of the challenges that, as I indicated, will require these additional resources. This is the thing about zero tolerance as a solution. It's quite easy. I mean, it's quite easy to come up to put some metal detectors, to get a school resource officer to say we're going to suspend you or expel you for these list of 10 infractions, and then when it happens, the protocol is straightforward. Teacher sends the kid down to the principal looks down at, or assistant principal more likely, looks down at the list, check, make the box, done, suspended, happens again, expelled, done. It's much, much harder to create that, first of all, positive school climate that will reduce the likelihood that the kids will get into trouble to begin with. And it's yet harder to create and put into place and have effective restorative justice, peer mediation. Randy talked about these things. It's real easy to say you have restorative justice, but it's real hard to do restorative justice well. It's much harder to do it well than it is to do zero tolerance at all, which is one of the reasons why we have less of it. So we need things like the resources that it sounds like are being put online, and that's a step in the right direction. But we need more than those sort of online resources. We need funding for things like I talked about before when I talked about the mental health counselors. The other thing that we need is accountability. And what I mean by accountability is, one, we need to focus on the ways in which, Randy talked about this, but some of the ways in which our existing accountability metrics can actually make matters worse. That's true. We also need to take a look at ways in which we could start to develop meaningful accountability measures that would evaluate some of the things that we're talking about here. In other words, why are we not keeping track of and asking schools to improve their numbers on things like expulsion rates, things like suspension rates, things like the number of kids that are being referred to juvenile court based on school-based incidents? We could do that. We could invest in the data systems, and then we could make that public. That could be on the report card along with whatever else we're including. Two more things that I think we need, and this one I think is the most important, and it's why I'm so glad that we have this panel. We need leadership on this issue, and we need it to be especially from educators. And that's why I think this is the beginning of a critical conversation, because lawyers and activists have played some of the lead roles on this issue, the Advancement Project, the Civil Rights Project out of UCLA. There have been some organizations that have really been pushing this issue for a number of years. But educators have to take the lead, because at the end of the day, everybody else is going home. The lawyers are going home. The advocates are going home. They're going back to, I'm going back to my office at Yale, where it's real cushy and there's no discipline problems. And the teachers are still the ones in the schools actually that have to make this work. They're the ones that have to translate the guidelines into an excellent school. And that's why I think that a teachers' union and a professional organization of educators is exactly the right organization, the right group to say, we are going to be the thought leaders on this question. We are going to be the ones that come up with the idea that no one else has come up with, and then we're going to push it. And the last thing that I think that we need, and the thing that will keep us all straight on this, is belief. Belief that we can change this. One of my favorite quotes on this topic is from Marian Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund, which is one of the first, Children's Defense Fund has been doing reports on this issue since before anybody else even uttered the term.
I was going to say before you were born.
Well, yeah, before I was born. Marian she says, and this is, I always keep this quote in my mind as a reminder that this struggle is not only important, but it's a struggle that we can win. She says, the pipeline, talking about the school to prison pipeline, is not inevitable or God created it, or God created. It's not inevitable or God created. We created it, and we can change it. So let's do that.